is South Africa a BRIC? And what does this mean? Or what about the rest? What about the other emerging economic powers, those dynamic markets? As I've said already, I'm very interested in looking beyond BRIC, and I don't think it wasn't really going to be the be-all and end-all whether South Africa was going to actually join BRIC. Obviously, this was a huge political and diplomatic kind of victory for South Africa, where we have been seen to be working very, very hard to actually join the group by our president visiting all of the BRIC members in 2010, and really every time punting South Africa's role and Africa's role in joining BRIC. But the other ones that we should always be aware of, and those I've just listed them there. Listen, and there are a huge number of these acronyms of emerging economic powers and dynamic markets. There's the next 11, which is the other Goldman Sachs. It's like the next tier of dynamic markets. There is the civets, which is actually, incidentally, Goldman Sachs' next 11, the next 11 after the BRIC, doesn't include South Africa. It's the only African country that it does include is Nigeria. Very, very interesting. And when South Africa did join, or when it was invited to attend the next meeting in April in Beijing, Jim O'Neill, the guy that actually coined the acronym BRIC, came out very quickly saying that South Africa is simply not a part of BRIC. It doesn't belong. It doesn't belong because of, again, its population size and growth trajectory. So it's not part of the next 11, but South Africa is part of the HSBC's civets. I believe it's HSBC civets, which is really Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, and South Africa. And I don't know what the Mavens stands for. I think Mavens, you got A in there, so maybe Argentina's in the Mavens. But anyway, what makes South Africa different? Now, just to look at this quickly, and just to put it all into perspective, and those of you that can't see, I'll just quickly explain. I've got here on the board, on this slide, the economic sizes of 10 of the largest emerging markets, the old emerging markets, in 2005, 2010, and 2015. And quite notably, have I got a little pointer here? It's there. I don't know. Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, it's not serious. Quite importantly, you can see there. There we go. Okay. It's a very small little ring dot. Quite importantly, you can see the top 4, and again, Russia. Another very interesting part is that Russia is part of this as well. But the top 4 are the BRIC, and then you have Mexico and Korea. But you'll see the top 10. South Africa doesn't feature in the top 10 emerging markets between 2005 and 2015. So the big question then, obviously, the one that is really looming there is, why is South Africa part of BRIC then? What makes South Africa so different? And why was South Africa invited to participate in the next meeting? I hesitate to say join BRIC because there's no such thing as a BRIC kind of bloc. So we were invited, and our Minister of International Relations and Cooperation said that this was the best Christmas present ever, and this was a great political and diplomatic triumph. Others said that this would encourage foreign investment. And most importantly, then, there were a lot of critics in South Africa and elsewhere around the world. Many of them said this might damage our relations in Africa. And then what I was really saying at the time was that that this is less of a reward than and more of a challenge and an opportunity. This was something, and it wasn't a reward for our progress on national economic successes. This was more a case of South Africa's geography, access to the African continent, and it was a challenge for us to actually engage and provide a facility as a platform, as a gateway, as a hub for the African continent. And South Africa, as what some might say, as the leading country in Africa, and often seen outside of Africa as the leading country, and some might say the locomotive of African economic growth, is the ideal platform for economic development across the region. There's no doubt about that. However, obviously, the fact that maybe the locomotive isn't going as fast as the carriages that it's carrying is a bit of an issue. South Africa's growth is much lower than the rest of Africa at this stage. But that's another point in question. The point is that we have a highly sophisticated private sector and capital markets, which can be used as a platform for economic development across the continent. there are no other takers on the African continent that can fulfill that role. So anyway, these were just some of the things that came about, but just very quickly, you can see the size differentials here in terms of between South Africa and the rest. South Africa is tiny. South Africa's got a population of 50 million people, a GDP around $350 billion. The next smallest one in terms of GDP size would be India, but look at the population size of over 1.2 billion people. And then you have China, which has got a GDP nearing $6 trillion and a population of 1.4 billion people. So really, we are really out of our weight category when it comes to BRIC. So then the big question is really then, why was South Africa invited? And the simple answer is Africa. We were invited because of Africa, because Africa is now clearly the provider of natural resources for the rapidly industrializing BRIC nations. It has a 1 billion strong, I must emphasize, youthful market, youthful consumer and labor market. And what I mean by youthful is that it is young and it will be one of the most important consumer and labor markets in the next 20 to 30 years. It's got exceptionally high growth rates, Africa, and possibly or arguably Africa will be the fastest growing region in 2011, and this is very, very important. And then something that is often overlooked outside of Africa, despite the risk involved in investing in Africa and the lack of infrastructure, Africa now has the highest returns on investment out of any other region across the world, which is quite interesting. So these are just some of the areas about Africa. Obviously, the BRIC countries have got vested and growing interests on the African continent. And then most importantly as well, if you are going to be discussing issues of global relevance, and there is some issue around, if the issues on the table are around a development agenda, global development agenda, you just simply have to have Africa and some representation from Africa in the BRIC forum then. So those are just some of the issues. That just gives you an indication of how investment has grown. We won't go into that really, but just it's as simple to say that 10 years ago, there were only 2 countries really in Africa that had an excess of $100 billion of investment stock. Today, there are a huge number and it's growing. Angola, Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, those are some of the biggest attractors of foreign investment in Africa and now increasingly in the world, and the investment is coming from the BRIC countries themselves. So, South Africa's invitation to join BRIC really brought to the fore a discussion in South Africa around our economic plan, our economic development plan, and the whole notion of South Africa as a gateway economy to Africa. South Africa, I think it goes without saying that the future, given South Africa's lackluster economic performance and growth over the last few years, the future of South Africa and of South African companies is on the broader continent outside of South Africa. So really the future of South Africa is really very much hinged to the future of Africa itself. South Africa is seen as a representative of a vast continent with enormous potential, but there is a big question mark. There is a big question mark as to whether the rest of the African continent sees South Africa as a feasible representative of the rest of the continent. Obviously, the size and the sophistication of South Africa's private sector and its capital markets, and the reforms that have been undertaken in South Africa's capital markets is an enormous exception in Africa, and does provide, as I've said before, an ideal platform for economic development. Quite simply, South Africa's invitation to join the BRIC group of countries, I believe, and this is where I see a very positive spin from this, is I believe it will be a catalyst, the much needed catalyst that South Africa has needed to prioritize our constructive engagement and, most importantly, our leadership, to take up a much stronger leadership position on the African continent in a more practical way, and to actually embrace the concept and the notion of a gateway economy. Because we talk about it here in Argentina, yes, South Africa is obviously the country of choice, but believe me, in South Africa, this is something that is debated and often not fully digested in the policy-making world, and in terms of of creating an enabling environment for South African businesses and other investments coming through South Africa into the African continent. This has been an opportunity now where we have been given, well, we have been provided this opportunity where South Africa as a country, as an economic gateway or an economic hub, needs to open literally the investment veins of the African continent. And we will be instrumental in Africa's economic development and through the BRIC capital and things coming in. Just very quickly, in terms of what makes South Africa so different to second-tier dynamic markets, this is something that is often overlooked. And actually, Felix, we at one of the talks that we did at the Standard Bank Foundation, this was one of the issues that I raised, is that something that is often overlooked about the South African economy is the size of its private sector and the sophistication of its private sector. We all know that South Africa has got a highly sophisticated financial sector and service sector, but we often overlook the physical size or the market size of its listed companies. And there you get an idea. For second tier, and this is really, I mean, when they distinguish BRIC countries from the second tier of dynamic markets, the Indonesias, the Colombias, the Vietnams, they always highlight the fact that those countries lack a highly competitive private sector with profound capital markets that provide a platform for economic development. And that is where South Africa is different to those economies. We might be smaller, but we have got a very, a very strong and comparatively large private sector and capital markets, and very advanced and or developed capital markets that can really facilitate the ambitions of BRIC and others into the African continent. And there you can just see it. South Africa's market capitalization of listed companies as a percentage of GDP is 180%. So literally it's nearly double the size of our economy. If you look at the other BRIC countries, obviously their economies are much larger. But when you take an economy of comparative size to South Africa, Argentina's market capitalization of its listed companies is just nearing 16%. So the market capitalization of South Africa is nearing $600 billion, where that of Argentina is probably in the region of about $40 billion. And that really gives you the differential sizes of South Africa and its competitive edge, or its comparative edge, if you want to look at it again in Ricardian terms. And that's something that's quite important in understanding the economic rigor in South Africa that has developed over time. Just some final remarks and just something to leave you with, and that we should not forget about BRIC and South Africa's membership of this grouping. BRIC, as I said, is not an alliance of like-minded developing countries. There's very little in the form of political consensus. Histories of economic development are vastly different. They are also natural competitors. They might be emerging economic powers, but this often disguises the brutal competitiveness between these countries. And there are going to be some serious issues, some serious monetary policy issues to look at, because monetary policy in these countries is no longer just a domestic or a national issue. It's one that, because of their nature and their size and their integration in the global economy, these policies of currency have become global issues and issues for a global discussion. Like I said before, just one or two other points that I think that are important, just in terms of the inconsistencies, I'd like to call them in BRIC. You know, Brazil, India and China are rapidly growing economies, but Russia is in relative decline and far from an emerging economy. Brazil and India are democratic states, very importantly, with mixed economies. Russia and China are autocracies with strong elements of state control of their economy. As I said before, they might share similar interests, but there's a huge amount of trade and economic policy conflicts. There's little in terms of political consensus, and really the priority in BRIC, as it's been up to now, and this is something that South Africa has to really grapple with, the priorities up to now have been economic, or more specifically market access related opportunities, and we've got to really understand that. So South Africa is an unlikely fit in BRIC. I think what we've got to do now as South Africa, and as part of this new position, or this new opportunity that has been presented to us, we have to utilize our large and highly sophisticated private sector, our capital markets, and pursue this agenda of a gateway economy for Africa. This must be matched, obviously, by a higher degree of diplomatic sophistication across the African continent, and policy that works in concert with the commercial aspirations of our private sector. So that there has to be common language between the South African business and the policy making circles in South Africa, which is something that is hotly debated. I don't know about here in Argentina, but in South Africa this is something that is seriously debated on a day-to-day basis. And finally, I think, and this is the point that I just want to leave you with really, is that this might have been the best Christmas present for South Africa and a great chance, but we should not lose sight of the fact that this is an enormous opportunity, but it comes as an enormous challenge. This is the first time, I think, since 1994 where South Africa has really been pushed again, as it was in 1994, into the limelight. Back in 1994, we were talking about how South Africa's participation in the WTO and the old G20s, etc., was one of which South Africa was punching above its weight. This is another example of where South Africa is going to have to seriously punch above its weight and improve its levels of diplomatic engagement, and pursue now, more so than back in 1994, pursue now a common agenda in terms of government policy across the African continent and internationally, and with South African business. I think with that, I'll leave that there, and then we can have a little bit of a discussion. Okay, so we started off with some difficult questions, but I think just in terms of why would South Africa choose to do this, I think it's just by nature South Africa's foreign policy outlook since 1994. It's actually pre-1994, and in fact the ambassador's in a better place to speak about this, but South Africa has always been at the center of these types of decisions, of global decision making, and they've embraced these positions of immense responsibility in the past. And I don't think South Africa actually has much of a choice any longer. As a leading nation in Africa, and as recognized outside of Africa as the leading nation on the continent, we have to embrace these positions, whether they might be construed as good or bad, outside of BRIC. I was also quite concerned about what this meant for South Africa, and whether it might detract from certain national issues and national priorities. But this is the reality that we live in South Africa, as a highly integrated and highly participative country in these markets, in the global political economy. Now, whether we choose to, or no matter how we choose to view BRIC has now taken on, like I said, a life of its own, and it's now regarded as really the foremost cluster of emerging economies, the hardcore, as I said, of dynamic markets. So that's just an issue that I suppose South Africa has to actually accept, or has to deal with in its policy making and its engagement with other countries. And I believe that the concern that you raised around this is going to be echoed and amplified in Africa. I think that African countries might see this as quite threatening, because we might be viewed as taking China's side on certain controversial issues across the African continent. Brazil and India are still relatively liked across the African continent, but China's, many African countries are quite ambivalent about the role of China in their markets. So this could be quite a sticky issue. The other issue that has come to the fore is we forget a lot about IPSA, the previous forum, trilateral forum between India, Brazil and South Africa, which was based predominantly on democratic principles. And there was always, since the start of IPSA in 2004, 2005, I think it was launched in 2003, China has tried to get on board and were prevented from climbing on board because they are not seen as a democratic country from the developing South. And now all of a sudden you'll note that China was the country that invited South Africa to join BRIC, and South Africa is the next host of the IPSA summit in Pretoria or Johannesburg in 2011. So I presume then that China will be expected to be invited to join the IPSA summit. So there's a lot of political kind of two-stepping and hot potato tossing, if you like, that South Africa is going to actually have to, and that they're going to have to deal with diplomatically. I'm not going to go into the